Whenever I visit a museum, I find myself captivated by the Grisaille works of the old Flemish masters. They used this technique to create breathtaking trompe-l'oeil effects. So, this inspired me to create this video and paint a Grisaille in that very tradition. In oil painting, color can often be a distraction. Grisaille allows us to understand the architecture of light in isolation. If you master the values, you master the painting. A Grisaille in the style of the old masters is the ultimate study for this. Instead of a common plaster cast, I've chosen one of the most famous marble masterpieces ever created, Michelangelo's La Pieta. While painting from life is idle, the Pieta is in Rome. A high-quality photo reference is accessible to everyone and provides consistent lighting conditions. I am demonstrating this process of Michelangelo's masterpiece because the principles are most evident here. Yet the system remains identical, whether you are painting a simple plaster cast or a Renaissance masterpiece. So let's go to work. What can you learn from such a study? First, a profound sense of humility. What we find challenging to capture with a brush, Michelangelo carved from a block of marble using simple tools at only 24 years old. Then you learn to see values. Identifying absolute values is difficult for the human brain. It naturally seeks to interpret values relatively. The squares A and B have the same value. You learn patience. You learn to make compromises. You learn to solve problems using only your brush. Now a few notes on materials. A fine weave canvas helps, or primed wooden panels as used by the old masters. I used a simple medium grain canvas here, which also works. For applying the paint, I find medium soft brushes ideal. Bristles are often too stiff, while sable is usually too soft. I have used Raphael Cavarin brushes for Grisailles for a long time. They used to be made of genuine mongoose hair, but for animal welfare reasons they are now synthetic. They are one of the few synthetic brushes that truly work for me. An alternative would be Winsor & Newton Monarch brushes. For delicate blending and softening edges, I use soft brushes like the Habico glazing brushes made of pony hair or sable brushes. As always, I paint solvent-free. For the paint itself, I recommend highly pigmented, stiff or so-called short paint. I have had excellent results with old Holland and Blockx paints here. A common problem with cheap, overly soft or oily paint is that you have to apply it thicker to achieve coverage, especially in dark areas. This leads to smearing and makes blending values significantly harder. With high coverage, stiff paint, this process is much easier. For this study, I used Old Holland Neutral Tint and Blockx Titanium White. Here are some fundamental techniques for painting such a Grisaille. Whenever possible, place different values side by side first, like a mosaic, and then blend them. Paint hard edges where necessary, but soften them slightly to make them appear more natural. You don't have to match every tonal nuance one-to-one immediately. It is often more effective to lay in a flat area and then work lighter or darker paint in wet on wet. If I need to layer paint at an edge, for example, I dab the paint on a bit thicker, especially if I notice the brush is pushing the underlying wet layer away. Always wipe your brushes clean on the rack when switching values. I always use 2 brushes for each size, one for the light values and one for the dark ones. Before we dive into the full painting process, let's look at the objectives. What was the challenge? First, capturing the appearance of marble. Then, achieving a credible distribution of light and shadow. For example, I slightly muted the sharpest highlights from the photograph. And, of course, the painterly rendering of edges. Where are they hard and where were they lost? Beside value distribution, edge management is the most critical aspect of a realistic appearance. First, the background, which I lay in evenly using a dark grey. I've prepped the canvas with a warm, burnt umber imprimatura, which will bring a certain vibrancy to the Grisaille. I pre-mixed my 6 value steps into tubes. There's a dedicated video on my channel covering that process. I am using a black and white printout as a reference. A value finder card like this can be highly effective for identifying specific values. I start by painting the head covering and Mary's robe to establish reference values for the face, as the face is where the viewer's eye will ultimately rest. Where it makes sense, I place value blocks side by side first, before refining and blending the areas together. Rotating the canvas on the easel helps with painting clean edges, so it can occasionally cause you to lose your orientation. The status robe features a vast amount of drapery. Taken on their own, the patterns are quite abstract. In this area along the edge of the figure, I first define the relationship between the midtones and the dark cast shadows. I want to keep the garments slightly darker overall than they appear in the photo reference, to give myself a bit more headroom later for the face. Here I dab the paint on a little thicker, otherwise I would end up pushing and mixing the already applied layers, which would prevent me from achieving a dark, deep value. I am painting most of the Grisaille in a single layer. I will only apply a partial second layer later for refinement. Nevertheless, I try to get as close to the final result as possible during the first pass. Before laying in large tonal areas, I orient myself by mapping out the dark sections and boundaries using almost dry paint. Without this step, it would be far too easy to get lost in the abstract patterns. Today I'm painting the first skin tones on the neck. I now have sufficient reference values within the painting itself to guide my decisions. Once again, I map out dark orientations within the area I intend to paint today. On the neck, I work my way from the light to the dark values, placing the shapes adjacent to one another. Afterward, I blend them using a soft brush. Today, I'm tackling the right side of the head covering. First, I establish my orientation marks again. I am skipping large portions of this session, as much of the process is repetitive and the patterns are not overly complex. Today, I am painting the Madonna's face. The values are already somewhat dictated by the completed neck section, and I use those as my guide. First, I reinforce the underdrawing at critical points such as the eyelids, mouth and nose. In a portrait, a deviation of just a single millimeter can produce a completely different expression. On the other hand, a micrometer accurate copy of the reference does not guarantee that you will capture the desired emotion. But this is just a study, so we won't let that discourage us. Next, I block in small areas of the face, based on how I envision the values. Notice the value just below the right eye and how I am unable to maintain it later on. I actually have to go a step darker. This happens because values always exist in relation to the neighboring tones. Once again, I follow the familiar method. First place the shapes in the correct values, then blend and refine. Now for the cast shadow of the veil across the face. This presents two distinct challenges: keeping the hard edge of the cast shadow just slightly soft, and capturing the subtle value variations within the shadow itself that make it look alive. Finally, a few refinements and highlights on the face. This concludes the first layer. Now the painting needs to dry. To ensure the second layer, which is only applied partially, can be executed smoothly, I apply a technique known as painting on a couch. To do this, I wipe a thin layer of oil over the dried first layer. I am using sun-thickened walnut oil here, but any other painting oil works just as well. Once the oil is spread evenly, I wipe it back using a lint-free rag. It remains a film that you can barely feel, so you can see it on your fingertips. This oil couch offers a major advantage. The paint glides on effortlessly, allowing for soft transitions into the dried paint layer. Furthermore, it ensures full compliance with the fat over lean rule in oil painting. First, I deepen the dark values within the deepest recesses of the shadows. A cotton swab works well for lifting paint away from areas where it doesn't belong. The thin oil film assists with this as well. Now I reinforce and rework a few midtone areas where the yellowish imprimatura is showing through too strongly and the value requires minor adjustments. Lastly, I address the highlights. The reflections along the fine edges are particularly effective to creating a more convincing realistic impression. I hope you find this study insightful. I admit that Michelangelo's drapery requires a great deal of patience. If you are new to oil painting, feel free to start with a classic plaster bust as used in many art academies. So, thank you for watching. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments.